It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means Smart Talk Radio is in your future, and you all know that after all these years. And got a special, interesting topic today that in 700 plus shows we have never talked about specifically, and that is the Magna Carta. We're going to be talking with a person that knows it well. His name is Koerner. He is a British-American political commentator. He recently wrote the piece 800 Years On, the Magna Carta for Our Time. He's also set up a website, Magna Carta US, as a celebration and reassertion of the values of the Magna Carta. Robin, how are you, my friend?
I am very good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. You say Magna Carta, and people go, yeah, I know it. I remember from history, but I don't know it. If you held a gun at my head, I'm not totally sure its significance. Let's do this. Give our Lewis at Large listeners, the few that don't know about that document. Tell us about it, and why should we care?
Okay, well, you should care, to answer the last part of the question first, because without it, there would not be the American Bill of Rights, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, more or less. I mean, I'm approximating, but that's more or less the case. In the sense that the Magna Carta, which was sealed in a meadow by the Thames in 1215, it's 800 years old this week, right? 800 years old this week. That document in 1215, sealed by King John, instantiated many of the fundamental rights that we now take for granted and were indeed enumerated in the American Constitution. Now, those rights have been fought for really for 1,000 years. In a political wrangling between the people or representatives of the people or a small group of the people on the one hand and the king or the state on the other. And some would say that the Magna Carta in 1215 is the most important milestone in the establishment of the people's power over the state for a number of reasons. It instantiates these rights of ones that we take for granted now, the right to a fair and speedy trial, for example, habeas corpus. In fact, 5 of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights can be traced directly or indirectly to this 800-year-old document. But most fundamentally, what was important about this document was that it firmly put the king under the law. Right, so it was the first time, it was the kind of the most important time in the history of the Anglo tradition, which is kind of this liberal in the proper sense of the word liberal, not in the modern American sense of the word liberal, this liberal tradition in which the United States was founded. It was the first time that law became above men. It's a fundamental step away from tyranny. And indeed, the founders, when they were writing the founding documents of our nation, of the United States, they were very familiar with the Magna Carta. And indeed, the very first colonists in the 17th century actually formalized Magna Carta, which at that time was obviously between 400 and 500 years old, as the basis of the governing laws of their colonies, right? And indeed, references to Magna Carta were actually included in some of the original constitutions of some of the original colonies. So there's a lot to it here.
Well, I believe, am I right, that there is a copy, if not copies, of the Magna Carta actually enshrined in the National Archives in D.C., is that correct?
I am delighted to say that is true, yes.
So what is again, for those of us erudite Lewis at Large listeners that might have missed that day in history, in world history, what was the kernel, what was the spark that created it, the evolution that led to that document?
Okay, well, that's a great question. Again, it's a short question with a long answer. But basically, some things never really change, right? Mark Twain said history rhymes. And, what happens is power often overreaches to the point that people begin to think that rights that they already believed they had, that they have been taking for granted, would disappear if things were allowed to carry on. And King John was a corrupt official. Property was not safe. Indeed, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness under King John was not safe. Indeed, King John even ceded the sovereignty of the nation that he ruled to the Pope and basically leased it back as a kind of fiefdom. And he did that for political reasons, to protect himself against invasion from the continent. Again, as I say, it's all rather complicated. But basically what it comes down to is the barons wanted security in their property and their liberty, and they rightly did not trust King John to give it to them. King John had a record of imprisoning people unfairly, selling justice. That's another thing the Magna Carta enshrines. There will be no sale of justice, right? So taking corruption out of the legal system, for example. So a number of things that John was guilty of that the barons insisted on putting an end to. And they knew that if they were going to really be able to do this, they had to have a mechanism to basically control the king when he stepped out of line. So another reason why this document is so important is it's the first constitutional document where that mechanism is clearly delineated. There is a council of barons that gets to determine if the king is out of line, and if so, can actually take remedial action against the king. That was what they felt they needed at the time, and that is what they did. Now, obviously, it didn't last, right, because a document is just a piece of paper. So the document had to be reissued and fought for time and time again throughout the years. But, the very fact of kind of externalizing these ideas to basically, as I say, bring the power back to the barons from the king, who was wielding arbitrary power, that was the important thing to them.
What about the view of the rest of the balance of the world, free world or not, of this document? Is it relevant to them? Do they think about it, or is it irrelevant to them, or in some cases it may be even scorned? It's definitely exceedingly relevant to all of the English-speaking peoples, right? Anywhere where the British were, obviously including the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, arguably to some extent India, Singapore, Hong Kong, where with the English language and this Anglo tradition, again, I'm using Anglo in a broad sense, where there is common law, the Magna Carta sits at the root of that legal and political tradition. And I should say also, just to be clear about this, the Magna Carta really is one of arguably 5 documents that comprise the genealogy, the heredity, if you like, of the American founding. There was the 1100 Charter of Liberties by Henry I, then Magna Carta in 1215. There was the Grand Remonstrance in the 17th century, also the English Bill of Rights in 1689. All of this before you get to the Declaration of Independence, which draws, as I say, directly on each of those documents. So there's a very rich history to the United States, but to the liberties in the United States that also provide, it's the same history as, the Canadians have, the Australians have, the New Zealanders have, for example, because they're all born out of this same legal and political tradition of which Magna Carta is an important part. So it is revered. There's a copy in Australia. It's referenced in Supreme Courts across the English-speaking world. And if it isn't revered, frankly, that's a travesty, because if we want to protect our liberties, we need to know how we got them. To know what something is, you really need to know something of where it comes from. Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, and of course, we're in the middle of some Smart Talk Radio here. I can tell you, for the first time in some 20-plus years, we are talking exclusively about the Magna Carta. It has never been talked about, sadly, on this show, but we're talking with an expert, Robert Koerner. He's a British-American political commentator. He recently wrote 800 Years On, the Magna Carta for Our Time. He referenced earlier in the show that 800 years ago this week, it was signed and set up. He's also set up the website magnacarta.us as a celebration and reassertion of the values of that document. Robin, I'm curious as to When you did research, like many documents such as this, that tends to be sort of a social and political statement and line in the sand. And I'm curious at the time how it was received, so to speak, by the local authorities.
Well, it's interesting because, many commentators have pointed out that this really wasn't a document of the people against the government. It was a document of, some barons who were some of the most privileged people in the state, or in the country. I mean, we might not use the word state when we're talking about 13th century in the same way. And indeed, again, I'm making the point, I guess, repeatedly, but the king himself was not the state in the way that we conceive the state. That all said, there was a reason why this document was written. A number of originals of the Magna Carta were actually written and distributed across the kingdom. And it was received by the people more broadly as a new basis for the securing of their rights. It took some time for this understanding of the importance of Magna Carta to, infuse completely through society. And indeed, it wasn't called Magna Carta for quite some time after it was actually sealed and distributed. But it definitely did affect the thinking of the nation, let's say, further down into the masses than just the barons themselves. And also, it's worth mentioning, it was happening in a historical context across Europe, where the idea of communes and the assertion of small groups of people, of civil society over central government that idea was rising in different ways, in different languages in different parts of Europe. So, there's a very rich kind of context in which it arose.
Do those in Europe, do they have an appreciation for it, in your opinion? I know in America, I think I'm safe to say that while many are familiar with the names, some are familiar with some of the history, very few of us have a real appreciation for the depth and its impact ultimately on many of our documents, as you mentioned earlier. What do you think? Do we appreciate it enough?
I mean, I don't think you do appreciate it enough because, in a sense, before the 17th century, much of American legal and political history, I'm going to make a statement that some people might object to, but essentially much of American political and legal history before the 17th century is British history. I mean, as I say, the 1776, 1789 are milestones in this Anglo-classical liberal kind of tradition. And the founders were very conscious of that. I mean, they read this stuff, they knew Magna Carta, they knew the English Bill of Rights. In fact, they saw themselves, if you like, as kind of, as conservatives of a birthright, right? They were conserving the birthright. They weren't revolutionaries in the sense of throwing out something and setting up something new. There was nothing new about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, and the principles that were written into them. They all come out of this Anglo tradition. So, no, I don't think we do know enough about it, but actually I'm not just going to blame the Americans for that because, on the side of the pond where I come from in England, I mourn for the fact that, the British are allowing themselves to be affected by the rising tyranny that is the European Union. And I often feel that if they really appreciated how hard won Anglo liberties were, they may not be so willing to give them up and let them be subsumed under a European superstate, which is unfortunately what's happening in my native land.
What about, Robin, again, your knowledge of it, the Magna Carta specifically? How specific, how detailed is it? Talk to us about its length, and I guess it's not fair to compare it to the Declaration of Independence or our Bill of Rights, but in essence, tell us about it as a physical document.
Okay, so there were a number, as I say, there were a number of originals written and distributed. They are of different shapes and sizes, but they're basically each on one large piece of parchment, right? One large piece of parchment each. And they were actually brought together at the British Library. The four surviving, we could call them original copies, if you like, or original versions, were brought together in the British Library this year in February as a to celebrate this kind of amazing anniversary. So, yeah, it's there isn't kind of, as it were, one answer to that question. The document actually is. We remember now some of the very general fundamental principles of liberty that are in there. But many of the clauses in Magna Carta refer to very specific things, like boats and fishing on the Thames, right? Weights and measures, inheritance laws that affected the barons. They're really quite specific. So we tend not to, think about them now, and they kind of, disappeared into history, as it were. They were very much of their time. But, of course, some of the principles that we've talked about are timeless, and that is why Magna Carta is said to be a foundation of, certainly of liberty under the law. You might say political liberty. But you could rip out probably about 80% of Magna Carta and still be left with the clauses that are fundamental to our liberties. The other 80% wouldn't be relevant to us today.
What, and again, this was in English-speaking countries, and then ultimately the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. Put it in today's context. Who is writing, or who is a candidate to write a modern-day Magna Carta for another time and another place and another era?
Well, I took a liberty, excuse the pun, by actually doing just that. So you mentioned kindly magnacarta.us, and that is my attempt at a Magna Carta for our time. The Magna Carta, like other constitutional documents in history, some of which I mentioned, were basically, they listed grievances and then listed demands to address those grievances. And Magna Carta was more or less written in that kind of a manner. So on magnacarta.us, what I have tried to do is identify grievances that I think pretty much all of we the people as Americans feel now. The oppressions that we feel perhaps from our state, from our government. But in a completely non-ideological way. So not offenses against liberalism or conservatism, the Democratic platform or the Republican platform, but against our basic human sense of justice, which indeed, in my reading of history, is what these important pro-liberty constitutional documents always come out of. The people go, enough is enough. So I have listed on magnacarta.us, in what I call a Magna Carta for our time, grievances that I think we rightly have today against the way we are being ruled, injustices in the way that we are being ruled. I've documented them, and I have documented what I think are reasonable remedies. So anybody's invited to go to magnacarta.us and see for themselves. Perhaps they agree or perhaps they don't agree. And I'm sure if anybody reads that, whether they be a left-winger or a right-winger, they're going to think, well, he's missed out a load of stuff. He should add X, Y, and Z, these awful travesties in the way that our country's being run. I haven't included everything that could be included in that document precisely because I don't want to put anything in there that half of the population will react negatively to. I wanted to have a document that I think pretty much 80, 90, 95% of Americans could unite around as an assertion of the rights that, as I say, are enumerated in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. The Magna Carta teaches us that we only, and many other points in history teach us, that we only get to enjoy the rights that we demand. And I think the takedown of rights in this country, certainly since 9/11, has been so severe that we're at a point in history where we, the people, really do need to remind the government that their power is delegated, that we delegate it to them for a particular reason, which is to protect our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's in the spirit of the Magna Carta, just as it's in the actual words of the Declaration. And it's from there that I wrote magnacarta.us. I would invite anybody else to give it a go. I did it with the help of a constitutional attorney called Chris Ann Hall, but actually it's in popular language for anybody to understand.
Well, we appreciate it. Our guest this segment for the first time in 20-some-odd years, talking about the Magna Carta specifically, his name is Robin Koerner. He's a British-American political commentator, well-traveled and knowledgeable, obviously, about one of the most important documents in human history. He recently wrote, again, the piece 800 Years On, the Magna Carta for our time, and set up the website that he has been speaking about called magnacarta.us as a celebration and reassertion and a reminder of the values held in that document. Again, Robin, thank you so much for being our guest. And again, give the website one more time and how they can find out more information, not only about the document, but also the other work that you do.
Oh, sure. Thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, so the website that we've been discussing is magnacarta.us. You can also find out more about what I do at the website associated with an organization that I more or less run called Blue Republicans. You can go to bluerepublican.org to see a bit more about where I'm coming from. I'm also a commentator, writer on various websites like truthinmedia.com, Huffington Post. So you can Google my name, Robin Koerner, Koerner, and find plenty of my writing.
Well, have a wonderful summer, and have a great 4th of July, too. How about that?
Thank you. I appreciate it. I do. You too.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.